Hi everyone, in Maayong Gabi if you're watching this in the evening. Maayong Gabi is Cebuano for good evening. I'm super excited about this quarter's MNOW. It's a little bit different than the other quarters, but it should be great all the same. I wanted to give a special thank you to Dr. Lim and Nathan for taking time out of their schedules to sit down and have a conversation with me and share about their identities. They were very vulnerable and open to sharing, which I think will be great for everyone to learn from them and to hear a little bit about their identities. I also wanted to say thank you to Bonnie and Paul for contributing to this video. Couldn't have done it without you guys, and it's been so amazing serving as this year's Catalyst Ministry Programmer, even if it had to look a little bit different because of the pandemic. But I'm super blessed to have had this opportunity and grateful to all of you for being a part of it. Okay. Hello everyone, thank you for joining us for Multicultural Night of Worship. This is a very different format than what we usually do, but I'm super excited to have these great conversations with some great people to celebrate Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. I have with me Dr. Lim. Dr. Lim, if you want to introduce yourself a bit.
Happy to. Well, it's a pleasure to be joining all of you for this fantastic event. My name is Bo Lim. I teach in the School of Theology. I'm a professor of Old Testament. I've been teaching here about 15 years or so. And so I'm just thrilled to be a part of this event. I've been involved in university ministries in the past. I'm very, very well familiar with this event, and so excited to be a part of it.
Great. All right, so let's get the ball rolling with the first question. So can you tell us a little bit about your ethnicity and culture and how it has shaped your identity?
Sure, that's a fantastic question. So I'm Korean American. I was born in Korea, and I immigrated to the United States when I was 2 years old. So I'm the youngest of 3 children, and moved to San Francisco. So I grew up in, San Francisco, a largely Asian, more diverse context, but within that, a Korean household and a Korean church. So it has been a big shaping influence in who I am, and that every Sunday I attended a Korean church and Korean was spoken in my household. But nonetheless, I really do identify as Korean American and Asian American because I grew up in a diverse background, neighborhood with schools and that kind of thing. And so my social circles were not solely Korean, were not solely Asian American. But having said that, it was a pan-Asian background. My high school, for example, was majority just Chinese. That's just Chinese. So all to say, Korean, Asian American, and a largely multi-ethnic backdrop of the United States is what shaped me. But in me being Korean, it has really shaped my faith in that the context of faith formation went alongside a cultural formation. Can't separate the two. And so, at church, I memorized scriptures in both Korean and English. But my Korean is not very good, right? I could recite a couple things in Korean. I could read a Korean hymnal. I could slowly read the Korean Bible, but I don't necessarily know what I'm reading. I can phonetically sound it out. And so I really do identify as a second generation Korean American, but it is this sort of liminal space in which there are parts of me and parts of my faith that have been shaped in a Korean context, but it's not solely that. And so it's always been to some degree, and for those of you who are part of 1.5 generation immigrant communities or have those kinds of generations within your church life, 1.5 to that kind of thing, and you're negotiating a bilingual context, and you're negotiating how the adults do things, how the young people. So my faith was constantly in a process of negotiating cultures and trying to discern what is faithful to Christ. But nonetheless, it was always present to me, the reality that our faith comes embodied in particular cultures. And the Christianity then was, I could never escape that, right? I thought I could at one point. I thought I could. And I was, I think, misled at one point to think that, oh, if I went to the white church, quite frankly, that I would be able to practice a pure form of Christianity. And that was a big, I was misled, right? That was a false teaching, because I did that and I realized, oh, they got a culture too. They got issues too, so forth, you know. And I always thought that, oh, we would be liberated from our issues, our problems, so forth, if I went to a white church. And I discovered that wasn't the case. And that was actually a turning point for me to then go, okay, how can I reclaim my faith? But it has been challenging, because it's not the same exactly as my parents. I love them to death. I'm not necessarily going to try to change them, but I recognize the path for me and the path for my children is going to be a bit different. So I'm in this sort of hybrid reality of identifying as a Korean American, as an Asian American, but also living a faith that is in a multicultural context.
That's great. So you mentioned that you grew up the San Francisco area.
Yes.
So a lot of Asian American communities there. How would you say, especially for those who grew up in like a different part of the US that have a predominantly white area, like I grew up in Texas, so my faith is very influenced by like conservative Southern church practices, and you found your own path for your faith. How would you say that you are contributing to the SPU community with that? Because it is a predominantly white evangelical space. So how are you taking your faith journey and your story and using that on this campus?
Yeah, that's great. It's been thankfully it's Seattle Pacific University. So, and what I mean by that is, I find myself part of multiple communities. So let me first say that I'm blessed by this Seattle Pacific community, but it is part of a larger Seattle community. And so there are parts of me, and if you're a person of color, you do this, you negotiate, right? We speak in code, we survey the landscape. What parts of me are safe to bring to this space? What parts of me can I contribute? What parts of me is perhaps one community just not going to meet, at least in the present moment? And so when I came to Seattle Pacific University, look, let me say this. For those of you who are who are persons of color and saying, gosh, it's not, SPU has a lot of work to do. It does. Okay, so I don't minimize it. But when I first came here, okay, I think, there was literally less than, a handful of Asian faculty and staff. And I think I could count the Asian students on like both hands, right? And so it really felt like a minority. And a couple of things. I felt called to this place, and not merely to assimilate, but generally to contribute. And so in a couple of ways, I immediately, I did kind of a couple of things. My very first year here, the Virginia Tech shooting happened. And if you're not familiar with that incident, it was a Korean male, mental illness issues, did a mass shooting at Virginia Tech. And just a horrible, horrible event. And we at SPU have experienced, not to the extent of a mass shooting, but we had our own experience of this, so we can sympathize here. But he was a Korean male. And that was part of the incident. And actually at that time, I actually had a couple of students, I felt that day not wanting to come to campus, just a sense of shame, right? This sort of collective shame, and because of the reality that, people tend to stereotype, people just to associate imagery and so forth. And I was in a coffee shop, had someone ask me, are Koreans more violent than other people? I mean, they literally asked me that. And I had students who told me that their parents, they were from Federal Way to Tacoma area, some people yelled at them, go back to your country, right? So now let me say this, the primary tragedy of that event was the victims of the shooting. So let me not minimize it, but nonetheless, this event demonstrated the dynamics of race. And so I was feeling a little bit, I'm going to put a sense of, best word, shame. And I don't say that proudly, but just this sort of collective feeling. And I noticed my other Asian students were feeling that way too. And so we met to console one another. We met and we actually started the first Asian American Association at SPU. Maybe it's now not in existence, and that's okay. I know that there's different Asian groups, but so I felt God called me to this place to one, support our Asian community, but also this. I remember at that time I felt to provide a witness too, a public witness. And I chose at that time to write something in the fall discussing the dynamics of this. So all to say, since I've been here at SPU, I felt called to both support and advocate, to educate, to bring, to help lift up Asian voices. I myself am engaged in Asian American biblical interpretation, Asian American theology. When I was chaplain, we hosted a full-on chapel during this month, 1 year. And so we have an opportunity, a unique opportunity to share gifts, to appreciate diversity in a way that no local congregation typically has a capacity to, right? You might go to a congregation that is 4,000 in number, but it's typically not as diverse as the composition of people here at SPU. And so for me, we have this unique opportunity and openness. And I very much felt then that even just my vocational journey as a professor has been shaped by the needs of this community and wanting to bring resources that help the Asian American community and also highlight the resources within the Asian American community to contribute to a larger ecumenical church and diverse society. So it's been in a good place. And let me just say one last thing, but part of that has been acknowledging that not all parts of me are always represented at SPU. And so thankfully at Seattle at large, it has a broader community. And so I found support and networking and friendship beyond the bounds of SPU at times. And that's okay. And that's sometimes I encourage our students that not necessarily, I wish you were always reflected here. And that's our goal as for me as a professor, I want every student to feel that they have a community here. But we're limited, I'll grant you that. So in those cases, even for myself, I've sought that support elsewhere, and that has helped me in the long run to feel supported to come back to SPU at times and to contribute.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So we are in a pandemic, obviously, and that is why we are in Zoom and not in person. But you mentioned before during the Virginia Tech shooting that there was some anti-Asian sentiment during that time, and we've definitely seen a resurgence of that with the coronavirus. And in these past couple of months, just in San Francisco, your hometown, so that probably hit a little hard for you. And just the kind of domino effect of anti-Asian hate crimes happening around the US. How you, as a Korean American, Asian American, Christian, how do you feel Christians that identify in a similar space should respond to these types of things? Because it can be hard to love people that are seemingly hating you for something you can't control, like your identity. How do you think is best to like respond or have grace in these situations?
Yeah, this is, let me say this, you know, I didn't grow up in a context that taught me how to advocate well. You know, I recently read I think it was like an op-ed by Chloe Kim, the Korean American Olympian. And I appreciated her sharing what she did. And it's really sad. It's quite tragic. It talks about how she's faced racism, she's faced misogyny, so forth. The, what is it? The snowboarding world is very, very white, right? And she was this young Korean American girl at the time when she was coming into the sport, and she was, and it was due to her father, right? And gosh, that story of her success being linked to her father and her father's sacrifice. Like, there's so much of me that I can identify with that. What's tragic is, though, that she goes on to say how she just didn't know how to handle this stuff, right? And how she was taken advantage of and so forth. And it's much later now that she's matured and has and this is later stage of her career as an adult, so forth, that she feels the capacity and the maturity to even just now speak out. And I share her story, and that's very much similar to me. My parents didn't teach me this, right? They were in many ways grateful to have escaped poverty in Korea. I know you look at Korea now and it's like bling bling, but when we arrived in the 70s, we were escaping poverty. I could talk more about my parents, but I looked at their old photos and, you know, my goodness, they weren't living at large in Korea. They were happy to land here, happy to be able to worship here freely and so forth. And they weren't strong assimilationists per se, but by and large, that was our default response, right? Fit in, do well in school, speak English, you know, so forth, right? And so to advocate for one's community, stand up against injustice, these kinds of things, my immigrant community did not teach me this. I wish it did, but I don't blame them. You know, some immigrant communities are escaping from trauma of literally war, right? So, you know, this is stuff that I've had to learn here. And I share all that just if you're like me. And, you know, I have some other, say, some African-American friends of mine. And sometimes I'm quite just awed by their ability, their resourcefulness to sort of stand up to injustice, and they have already responded. Now, the sad thing is that their community has been suffering this for generations, right? But what I've seen is that they were taught by their parents, right? And out of sheer necessity, so I have no envy toward this, but out of sheer necessity, for generations, they've been oppressed. For generations, they've been martyrized. So as a culture, they've had to learn to develop the skills. And it's just sheer survival to some degree to advocate for themselves, to call out injustice, to stand up and so forth. So that's been a learning process for me, right? Even just individually. And so, just sort of, I know I'm going roundabout to answer your question though, but I think one of the things then, I think what you are observing is more and more Asian Americans, I think this time around, right, finally, right, coalescing. And there have been, let me say this, people have been doing this for decades. It's not like the recent movements, the Stop AAPI hate movement is the, it's the first scene of this. There's been a long legacy of folks who've stood up. But I think what you are seeing is a critical mass, excuse me, MASS, of collective folks. And what you are seeing is this: you are seeing spiritual leaders now, right, who are not just kind of in survival mode for immigrant populations, right? That was my father, that my father was just trying to help Korean immigrants land here, right? I'm now here in my, I'm not just landing here, this is my home, right? And I want this to be the home of my kids and their kids. And if that's the case, I'm not just grateful to be here, I need to change here if this is going to be home for. So I think what you are seeing are faith leaders engaged in the social and national conversation, right? I have friends who are, whether it's mobilizing churches or not, in faith communities or not, faith-based organizations, using their resources to educate their own people and to advocate. And what you are seeing is Christians of faith seeing this as an act of faith. This is not some political thing that you do on the side, but they are seeing that their faith is enacted in their citizenship in a way that, for me, I didn't see that as much practiced by my parents. And so for me, how have I learned it? I've actually learned from other communities of color, particularly African-American community, right? This has been a practice of their faith for decades. And so we've looked over the shoulder at other brothers and sisters of color and learned from them, and now enacting that on behalf of my community, but also doing it in solidarity with other communities as well. Yeah.
That is so true. Thank you so much for sharing that. You are totally right in that it's a different context for those who are not immigrants. And definitely the survival is real, but now that we've transitioned with a new generation of people, like, this is their home, this is what they know, to be able to do it and do the hard work and speak up and advocate. So again, Dr. Lim, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to meet with me and answer some questions and just be super candid about your experience. I've really appreciated getting to learn more about you and your life and your faith, and I'm just really appreciative. If you have any parting messages, you can go ahead and say, but I think that's all from me.
Okay, well, I've appreciated being able to share, and I just want to affirm all of you. I know I don't know you personally, but all of you, that it took me some time to see my culture as not a liability but an asset. I know this may sound cliche, but I am so encouraged in you, and that you are realizing this. I didn't realize this until my late 20s, I think. It took me that much time. I regret not realizing it earlier. And so I just see that you all will do so much more. In fact, because of your awareness and seeing this culture, seeing your culture as a gift. And so I'm just deeply, deeply encouraged by our students. And so more power to you. Yeah, so great being with you. Thanks for having me.
밝은 빛이 가득해 추운 내와 사랑해 이곳에 모인 우릴 주가 기뻐하시네 주를 향한 사랑과 우리 모든 찬양을 주가 받아주시네 기뻐해 밝은 빛이 가득해 추운 내와 사랑해 이곳에 모인 우릴 주가 기뻐하시네 주를 향한 사랑과 우리 모든 찬양을 주가 받아주시네 기뻐해 찬양해 주가 함께 하시네 우리 사랑하시네 우리 마음을 들여 놀라우신 주 사랑 찬양해 그가 베푸신 사랑 우리 삶에 가득해 우린 기뻐 노래해 찬양해 우리 사랑하시네 주가 함께 하시네 우리 마음을 들여 놀라우신 주 사랑 찬양해 그가 베푸신 사랑 우리 삶에 가득해 우린 기뻐 노래해
Hello, everyone, and we are on to our next interview. I am very excited about this one. I am with Nathan Samayo, and he is going to open us up with a poem that offers some reflection.
Awesome. It's so good to be with you, SPU, especially in this really challenging time. I hope that this poem can actually serve as a time of grounding before we get started. And this poem is coming from, I hope y'all can see this clearly, or like the right direction, but it's called The Properties of Perpetual Light, written by Julian Uggin, who is an indigenous Chamorro from Guam, which is Guam. And he's a lawyer fighting for indigenous rights of people in the Pacific. So I'll go ahead and open this up in a poem. And it goes like this. Justice and patience are not exactly friends, but nobody knows this more than the Marshallese. They who watched the world turn red and the rain turn into a terrorist, whose thyroids were taken as were their voices, but not the love of singing or the memory of song, who buried too many beautiful babies to count, who've been denied not only big things like reparations, remediation, and a promise of return, but little things to look like arrowroot, flour, and the flesh of coconut crabs, who waited for years by the seashore for some small boat of deliverance to dock. Know the bitter truth. Waiting is empire's favorite game of all, and patience a parka of loneliness, to wear on an island with no chance of snow. And this poem is super powerful, and kind of what he was referring to was a series of American nuclear bomb testings that happened in the Marshall Islands from 1946 to 1954, with the biggest one in 1954 called the Bravo. And it deposited life-threatening radioactive fallout for the people in the Marshall Islands. And the fallout was so thick that people in the Marshall Islands thought it was snow. The kids were playing in it as if it was snow. And there were severe impacts of radiation on the Marshallese people. And many of them, there's one story of a woman who experienced 7 miscarriages. after the radioactive fallout, and there was many birth abnormalities, such as what they call jellyfish babies, which are babies who are born without bones and translucent skin because of radiation. And the National Security Advisor and Secretary of State at the time, his name was Henry Kissinger, he said, there's only 90,000 people out there, so who gives a damn? So this poem just highlights how the Pacific Islands specifically is pretty much a nuclear bomb testing site for the American militarism and imperialism. And they see Indigenous Pacific Islanders as disposable. So that's just something to keep in mind. And I'm realizing that's probably not, that's a heavy route to kind of start us off, but you know, sometimes, or a lot of the time, the truth hurts, but it still needs to be told. So I'm grateful to share this poem by Indigenous writer Julian Uggin in the Properties of Perpetual Light. Awesome.
Thanks, Nathan, for sharing that. If you want to go ahead and share a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, for sure. It's so good to be with y'all. My name is Nathan Samayo. My pronouns are he, him, his. And I'm a graduate, I'm alumni of SPU, graduated last year, June 2020. And I majored in sociology, minored in mathematics and history. And now I'm from Guam, which is Guam. My parents were both Chamorro. My dad, Chamorro, Filipino, and Japanese. I identify as gay. I also have severe ADHD and OCD. And now I'm over here studying at Harvard Divinity School, getting my master's of divinity. And I'm currently serving as a youth pastor in a city in Massachusetts called First Church in Ipswich, United Church of Christ. And hopefully I'll be teaching Christian theology, liberation theology, and Indigenous Pacific Islander theology after my time here.
Great, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and jump into the questions. So first one, can you tell us a little bit about your ethnicity and culture and how it has shaped your identity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just to give a little context, I was born in Guam. After a series of unfortunate events, my family had to move out here to the States. And yeah, we moved to Tacoma, Washington. Tacoma, Washington, I loved growing up in Tacoma. I'm definitely gonna go back there. I grew up also in a very thick Pacific Islander community. There's a lot of Samoans, Tongans, Marshallese folks over there, a lot of Chamorros as well. But it was a very underprivileged community with low socioeconomic status. So 1 out of every 4 people were at or below the poverty line. And so there was definitely some challenges living in that specific community when all your homies are living in households that it's hard to sometimes get the basic needs to sustain life. But I'm actually a first generation college student. And what happened was I got a full ride ethnic student leadership scholarship in Tacoma, Washington. And I went to a school called Trinity Lutheran College. But after the school went bankrupt, the school actually ceased instruction. I lost my full ride scholarship. And then my mom died and my grandma died all in the span of a couple months, which is why I ended up going to SPU. But I had a really good time over there, definitely had some moments of growth and really challenging moments there as well. I also served as the Catalyst ministry programmer as well. So that also makes me happy to be here, to be able to share. I served as student body president as well for 2 years, doing a lot of activism around queer identity and representation, and also homelessness in Seattle as well. And now I'm happy to be here to study, to be a pastor. Specifically with my cultural and ethnic identity, it's so interesting because I actually didn't recognize how significant my Chamorro identity, how much I embodied it until I actually left Tacoma. And, you know, part of it, there's a lot of different values that we have. It's a very matrilineal culture, which means that the mother and the grandma have specifically kind of, how do I say this? So back before colonialism, right? in Guam before Spanish colonialism, even the land was actually passed down through the matrilineal heritage. So, I mean, that's right. That's against kind of Western or European worldviews or like legacies, right? That it's very patriarchal and specifically like white patriarchal. But in Guam, in indigenous Guam before Spanish colonialism, land was actually passed down by the matrilineal heritage. So your mom or your sister, they actually inherited the land. And so that kind of showed up in the life that I grew up in, where my grandma and not my grandma, but my mom was actually the rock of the family. And so women empowerment, egalitarian relationships, right? Those were all really part of me growing up. And so even coming to SPU and moving out of Tacoma, moving out of my household in general, I actually thought I had this weird, I had this weird kind of, oh my gosh, why am I blanking on the term? When a person of color enters the white space and they have these weird moments when they recognize that they're different than the dominant culture. What? Yo, I'm like blanking right now.
I don't know the term either.
Wait, bro, I use the term all the time. Someone's watching this and they're like, bro, Nathan, I know.
I'm sure they are. Sorry out there.
Anyways, I thought it was weird that women didn't, like dominant culture didn't actually empower women, right? So actually being in the classroom as someone who identifies as a man, I actually had to be mindful of the space that I was taking up. And part of it wasn't that I thought that as a man, I should be able to speak up more than women, right? But I actually thought that in all spaces, women felt just empowered as men, right? And so when I entered college and someone was like, hey, Nathan, like, stop taking up all the breathing room, right? And like allow other people to speak, especially women to speak in the room. I'm like, oh, okay. I mean, I thought that women felt just as empowered to speak in the room, but now I get to be mindful about that. So it wasn't from a place of, that didn't come from a place of me thinking that I was higher than women, right? Or me thinking that my voice should be more centered than women. For the reason why I was speaking up more in class, it was actually because I thought, because of my cultural identity, I thought women were just as empowered to speak up, say what's on their mind, be able to call shots just as much as men were. Because if anything, being in a matrilineal culture, that's kind of, even at Chamorro parties, right? When it came to family decisions, the mother or the grandma in the household had a huge say in like how things went. And so that was a moment of what they call like disidentification, where we feel weird in a certain space because how we grew up or our culture didn't fit like kind of like the dominant political space that I then embodied. So that was that's a way that my cultural identity shaped who I am and how I think about the world and how people move in the world. And I didn't notice that until I came to college. But even down to the food, right? Even taking off our shoes when we enter the household. There's these different things that I think are normal. And then I enter kind of dominant spaces and I recognize that cooking an abundance of food, right? Because it's a cultural norm that we're supposed to make an abundance of food, even if there's 5 people, so that people can actually go home with food and then share food with other people. So, and that's the thing, right? Even if we're going to bring this kind of to our Christian theological understanding, at the Last Supper, Jesus said, break bread in remembrance of me. So at that Last Supper table, it was actually solidified that we should go on and make an abundance of food or create an abundance of opportunities for people to break bread with one another, right? And so even the creating an abundance of food for people to share within my culture so that they can go out and share that food and break bread with others, that was also kind of a cultural norm that, that I kind of grew up with. And ideas of scarcity, right? Or ideas of like, how would I say this? I would say sectarianism, in which we only care about our specific groups or the people we identify with without breaking out of those norms or breaking out of those structures that make us think that we're different, which obviously we live in a society where Black and brown bodies are criminalized. So that's a whole conversation in itself. But recognizing that everybody's family, right? And so we should go above and beyond to making sure that everybody has the basic necessities to sustain life. I feel like I'm going on a tangent now, but like the way that my cultural identity has shaped me is kind of a large question. Yeah, and so I'd be interested to see maybe how we can tackle that, maybe by talking about spirituality or worship or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned like you and your identity and what you knew, the foundations of who you are, and coming to SPU, which is a space that challenged that, in that even if there's more women on this campus, dynamics in the classroom, women are a little more hesitant to speak up, where they feel like they don't have as much agency as men. And just overall, it is a Methodist school, the white evangelical Christianity that is often like the narrative that a lot of people know, but it's not everybody's here. To be a student navigating that space and to be a student leader in this space, how did you feel you were called to like make a change or to like be a voice or challenge what this institution is known for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe we can tie some theology and also some Chamorro indigeneity ideas in there as well. So to kind of start with the little narrative, or a creation narrative, it's not little, excuse me, of the Chamorro people, right? So the story of Funas and Puntan, right? And it's a story about a brother and sister. And you know, I'm actually questioning if there's gender identity involved there, but that's something that I haven't necessarily studied yet. But the story goes as the brother and sister, and the brother's like, the brother knows that he's gonna die, right? So he actually tells his sister to make Guam and eventually the world out of him, right? And so his eyes turned into the sun and the moon, and his mouth turned into the rainbow, and his back, I believe, turned into like the land. And so his sister actually, after her brother died, after Punten died, his sister Fuma actually blown life, right, into the eyes so that the sun can shine and the moon can come at night, so that the rainbows can be in the clouds. And then she actually curled over, and with dust and rocks like kind of swirling over her body, the first people were born, right? And I think that's actually something that we can take with within the Christian creation story, right? Because I actually don't think that Adam and Eve were necessarily gendered, right? There's a kind of decolonial idea about Adam and Eve, is that it's actually a story about the rise of two empires, Egypt, and I believe it was either Babylonia or Mesopotamia, in the ancient Near East. And what happens is people were living, right? This is about 6,000 years ago, but people were living and they had to like do agriculture, right? But it was the rise of these two civilizations that actually started doing agriculture, not for the sake to sustain their life, but for the sake of accumulation, right? And that's actually when people started not being in right relationship to the earth, right? And so, and that's why the story of the Garden of Eden and earth and creation all came from, is this idea of now human beings being pulled away from the earth. And so kind of tying that into like what it's like to, I guess I like my indigenous story more, about more egalitarian relationships and with women empowerment who actually birthed, right? The first indigenous people of Guam and then eventually the world. Thinking specifically in the space, in the context of SPU, where it's another institution where white supremacy and heteronormativity and patriarchy are all alive and well, just like many other like higher education institutions in the US. Specifically how I navigated that space was, first of all, I think everybody needs to check their positionality, right? I think I identify as gay, right? But I also could identify as a cis man, right? So that already comes with sets of privileges that I need to be mindful about. And I need to check in with and know when to sit down and when to be empowered to empower others who maybe their voice isn't acknowledged within an institution like SPU just as much as my own is. But even being a person of color with white skin, right? I think that a lot of people of color who are in closer proximity to whiteness don't actually acknowledge how their colorist privilege, right, actually can get them farther in life and be accepted in certain spaces, right? So even me as a person who I say historically a person of color, right? Because I come from Guam, but I do have white skin. I think we need to be mindful about the spaces that we take up and be mindful about how race, especially when we talk about phenotype, it's all about what you look like, right? And race doesn't give a dang about your genealogy. It doesn't give a dang about your history, right? It cares about what you look like. And so even for people of color who are closer in proximity to whiteness, we have to be mindful about how our words are taken more seriously than maybe people of color or Black folks or Indigenous folks, right? Or our voices are more centered, right? And we have to make sure that we're empowering other people. For light-skinned men, empowering women of color, Black women, Indigenous women, to make sure that their voice is just as leveraged and their body is just as leveraged as people who, like, as white folks or men. And that's not to say that we're the savior in those spaces, right? But we can actually leverage other people by sitting down, right? So there's ways to kind of navigate that. And I think I brought up the Indigenous narrative, the creation story in that, because it is a story about egalitarianism and the ways that women actually breathe life, right, into creation and breathe life into the spaces that we're in now. And we have to acknowledge that as we kind of move through these different political spaces, especially in higher education. Does that kind of answer the question? I feel like
it does. Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool.
Period. Yeah. Full stop.
Period.
Everything you said. Love. Like, period. that is so real.
Yeah. And I think, right, people are learning. But the interesting thing, right, is I didn't actually know, I wasn't engaged in conversations around racism or sexism or patriarchy. But the thing, right, that's the antidote to those systems is to be in a posture of learning, right? I don't actually think we have to know everything. I think we actually have to be open to being wrong, right? To be in a posture of learning, because we never actually get there. I don't know what the hell there is. You know what I'm saying? We're gonna continue to learn how our bodies move in different spaces, and culture changes, right? It's not static. And so even if we think we're there, culture probably beat us 10 more steps, right? And so I think the antidote to combating systems of oppression and kind of systems that keep people, or evil systemic systems that keep people from not experiencing full and abundant life, I think the way it wins is for people to sit in kind of willful ignorance, right? Or for people to not continue to learn how they can show up better in spaces. And so I think if you're actually in a posture of learning and a posture of humility, and that's not to say that all people need to be in humility, because I think people are, I think people aren't, how do I say this? I think some people are society doesn't acknowledge people already. And so to say that someone should be humble, that can actually be harmful, right? But I think there's certain demographics where people can be humble and have humility and be in a posture of learning. And that can actually, I think that's actually an antidote to, plus, the institutional actions that fall with that and correlate with that can actually be the antidote, or not the antidote, the antidote to evil systemic systems. Yeah, and I think that can work at SP, and I think that's kind of what's happening right now because people are speaking up.
Yeah. I love what you had to say about culture is not static. It changes. And SPU for a while, I know they changed it this year, but like engage the culture, change the world. That was the SPU motto. And we've seen in this past week that our board of trustees is so detached from the students and the faculty and the culture that we're cultivating as a student body, as like a faculty body, just as SPU. We're not being represented at our board level. I know that you have done a lot of work in your time when you were ASSP president, and even just before then, but even as someone who identifies as queer, and you went to SPU, how did you take to the statement that was released?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. And so the first thing I want to address is that motto, engage the culture and change the world. You know, it's so funny because I think that people kind of criticize that statement from a place of like, you're not engaging culture, right? That's where I think a lot of people are at. But I think we actually need to take a step back even more. That phrase, engage the culture, that has so many coloniality. There is so much imperialism in that phrase, engage. It's a very like colonizing mindset, right? I actually study a lot of ethnography and anthropology, which is actually a colonial structure, because like the roots of like ethnography is like to go to these places and like dig in people, try to record how they do. That's how religion started, right? I believe like even religion, it started with this idea of the language of Sanskrit, right? And studying Hindu folks. And it actually became like, oh, like these folks are different. So let me engage the culture and like try to figure out who these people are. Let me record them. It's very colonial. We just got to acknowledge that engage the culture is a very colonial term. I think it needs to be abolished, right? They need to change it because folks criticize them and say, you're not actually engaging our culture. The hell I want you to engage I don't want you engaging in my culture. Like, no. And then change the world. And I'm like, are you trying to civilize? Is that what that means? Are you trying to civilize someone? Like, are you trying to change their world? Right? To think that Western epistemologies and ways of thinking and Western philosophy and theology is going to be able to change the world. Yeah, I think you are changing someone's world. If you want to go in there and imperialize and colonize, if it's allowed for me to say this, like we need to abolish engage the culture and change the world. That's a very colonial statement. So there's that. That's what I gotta say about that. But you know, I think we need to be mindful, right? That so my time at SPU is a constant interrogation. Right, I think that SPU tries to shape disciples, right? That's kind of the language that they use. They try to make like how to be in community with someone else. But man, I haven't thought so critically about what it looks like for a place at SPU. I think we try to mask white supremacy very with language of diversity, right? And language of like reconciliation when used irresponsibly, without actually wrestling with what reconciliation means, and you know, words like diversity, inclusion, they're all thrown together, right? It's like they're like buzzwords, and that's not to say that the words itself and the meanings behind them are buzzed. I think they are buzzed by people. I don't actually think those are buzzwords that I think people use it very irresponsibly, and we don't really ask the question of what's at stake when we say those. But it's interesting because one thing that I learned, and I think there's a lot to be said about like racism and sexism and patriarchy being alive in like the student life, or you know, student like interactions in the dorms, whatever that looks like. But even I feel like the ways that we're taught at SPU, and not being taught literature and liberation, right? Or being offered tools to critique systems of racism and sexism. And what I mean by that is that it's kind of unpopular to challenge status quos, right? Or invite people into new ways of thinking or new systems, right? So even this, the movement for abolition, right? Before the abolition of slavery, right, in the 1870s, which is interesting, right? Because we actually haven't, slavery just looks different through mass incarceration. But before the abolition of slavery, people didn't actually know, people couldn't even think of a system outside of slavery. They're like, oh my gosh, we're not gonna have slavery? Like, what else are we gonna have? Like, we need that, right? Because, you know, America's built on this kind of racial capitalism. And people didn't actually know what to think about outside of slavery. But now with high rates of police brutality that have been there ever since police units were formed through slave patrol, now it's being captured. So people are now seeing it, right? And it's even hard of all the trauma that we're just recording online now, and people just having to see Black Death after Black Death. But even within the movement with abolition, it's this constant invitation to let people know that there is something outside of caging people. There is something outside of policing. There is something outside of mass incarceration. Incarceration actually perpetuates cycles of violence. It's not rehabilitative, right? Or rehabilitating, right? I think people think that it works when it actually just creates systems of racism and poverty. Specifically now at SPU, I think that white theology, right, or not including critical race theory, and I'm just throwing a bunch of things out there, but I think it's hard to critique. Now leaving SPU and recognizing how I was trained as a scholar or trained as a student, I'm recognizing, like, why didn't we talk about post-colonialism, right? Post-colonial literature, right? Why didn't we learn about womanist? Why isn't womanist theology, right, or feminist theology, why isn't that foundational? Why is it labeled contextual, right? But, you know, white theology from Thomas Aquinas, right, or the Nicene Creed, right, those are considered foundational texts. And once they're done with those, okay, now you can go study liberation theology, right? But we have to question, what is our foundation? Right, and we have to keep interrogating our foundation. And I think that specifically in what I learned at SPU was that anything like liberation theology, right, or anything like post-colonial literature, so literature that tries to show how colonialism actually like caused harm, and to learn really like indigenous voices and indigenous worldviews. I think we sit comfortable without interrogating where our beliefs come from, right? I call it reference points. What are the ways that we critique the world, right? And I think that we haven't really asked, a lot of people are homophobic and say the Bible says it, but don't even actually know, haven't even read the Bible, right? But we're socialized into these thoughts and these ways of viewing the world without actually interrogating where they come from. And I think once we start interrogating where they come from, that's when we can actually start having real conversations. So specifically at my time at SPU, I think it was a constant interrogation of like, okay, so why does the statement on homosexuality say this, right? Who created the statement on homosexuality, right? Did those people have oppressive beliefs about queer people, right? And the statement that was sent out to the student body and to the SPU community, it sounded like they didn't even interrogate where their homophobic beliefs came from, right? Because it was a lack of interest in challenging the status quo, a lack of interest on challenging the kind of maybe free Methodist beliefs that they have. And the interesting thing about this is that a lot of people at SPU would say, oh, like, there's a lot more going on behind the scenes, right? So like, no, that stuff is going on behind the scenes. Are people of color supposed to trust all these white people in our lives, behind the scenes, no, I'm cool off of that, right? I don't trust, we should always be a suspicion. When people are like, oh, stuff is going on behind the scenes, okay, so are we supposed to trust it? Because obviously it's not working, right? So that's what I have to say about that. Yeah. There's so much to talk about in that.
Yeah. But I do want to be respectful of your time and just, wow, thank you again so much for speaking and being here tonight in this online space or whenever anyone is watching this video, and the wisdom you just like imparted on all these viewers, because I mean, like, period. To all of that, I think you've raised some great points and some great things that need to be addressed on this campus at a institutional level, not just like some students, some classrooms, some professors. Like this work needs to be done in community.
Yeah.
So yeah, do you have any like parting words?
Yeah, I guess the parting word that I have is to constantly interrogate, right? Our thoughts, our belief frameworks, other like institutions' belief frameworks, right? And really ask yourself, why do I believe what I believe? Or why do I know something as something, right? Especially in the conversation around queerness at SPU, really asking the question, like, where do my thoughts, right? Or where do my beliefs around queerness come from, right? Have I been socialized into something without critiquing it, right? So yeah, and that will open up, you'll actually learn a lot more about yourself when you interrogate where your belief frameworks came from. So that might be my last word. Yeah, but thank you.
Yeah,
thank
of course.
you, Rachel, and SCU community. See y'all later.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Tran. I'm an international student from Vietnam. Today, I would like to share a prayer in Vietnamese with you. I want to pray and thank God for the beauty of diversity, and also pray for the victims of the AAPI hate and the LGBTQ+ community. Tạ ơn Chúa đã tạo ra chúng con với những cá thể độc nhất vô nhị, với những khác biệt, đã đem lại rất nhiều sắc màu cho cuộc sống này. Con cầu xin Chúa hãy giúp đỡ cho những nạn nhân của việc phân biệt chủng tộc, bởi vì sự căm ghét đó đã đẩy họ đến con đường cùng và những trường hợp rất nguy hiểm. Con cũng muốn cầu nguyện cho cộng đồng giới tính thứ ba để họ có thể sống thật với bản thân, không bị xã hội dòm ngó hay dị nghị. Xin Chúa cho chúng con có thể đồng cảm và thấu hiểu những nỗi đau của họ, để chúng con không làm tổn thương nhau nữa. Cảm ơn Chúa.